Hey gang! Using the promo code MTGMudsta, all caps, will get you 10% off any order over $10 at Flipside Gaming. It'll also get you 10% off any orders of singles at Multizone. And it'll get you 10% off most products at Original Magic Art, with the exceptions of some paintings. If these fine sites don't have what you're looking for, you can also consider using my affiliate link when ordering from TCG Player. And if you'd like to join the Generic Goblin Gang to support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description below. Today's game is brought to you by the Gamebreakers gang. First up, we have Eric playing Shalai, keeping a Sunpetal Grove, Avacyn's Pilgrim, Strip Mine, Seedborn Muse, Vigor, Flagstones of Trocaire, and Forest. Martin is kind enough to have built the new Polukranos, keeping an Ash Barrens, a Nyx Weaver, a Swamp, Deadbridge Chant, Life from the Loam, Oracle of Moldiah, and Llanowar Wastes. Nick is playing his Marisi, Breaker of the Coil, keeping a Skullclamp, a Tilnali's Summoner, a Plains, a Sungrass Prairie, Cinder Glade, and Swords to Plowshares. New to the channel is Chris playing his Atemsis All-Seeing deck, keeping Cyclonic Rift, 2 Islands, Kasmina's Transmutation, Thassa, God of the Sea, Worn Power Stone, and Curse of the Swine. Martin wins the die roll and starts us off. Martin plays a Llanowar Wastes. Chris plays an Island. Nick plays a Plains and casts Skullclamp. At this point, Martin decides to cycle his Ash Barrens to find a basic. Eric plays a Forest and casts Avacyn's Pilgrim. Martin plays a Forest and casts Life from the Loam and returns his Ash Barrens to hand. Chris plays an Island and gets aggressive using a Kasmina's Transmutation on the Pilgrim. Nick plays a Tap Cinder Glade. Eric plays a Sunpetal Grove. Martin dredges back a Life from the Loam and then plays a Swamp. He casts a Nyx Weaver before passing to Chris. Chris draws and passes. Nick plays a Sungrass Prairie and casts Mentor of the Meek. Eric plays his Brushland and passes turn. Martin mills his 2 for the Nyx Weaver trigger on his upkeep, and he then casts a Ramunap Excavator. He plays a Swamp from his graveyard and passes to Chris. Chris draws for turn, playing an Island. He casts a tapped Worn Power Stone and passes. Nick draws and casts his Tilnali's Summoner. He pays the 1 to the Mentor of the Meek trigger as it comes in, drawing from it. Responding to this, Eric casts Eldamri's Call. Nick then moves to combat, and the Mentor hits Chris for 2. Eric reveals an Oracle of Moldiah and puts it to his hand as we move to his turn. Eric plays a Flagstone of Trocaire, and then an Oracle of Moldiah. He plays a Strip Mine for a second land for turn, and passes while Chris looks at Eric's top card. Martin mills his top 2, and draws. He plays his own Oracle of Moldiah, and plays his Verdant Catacomb from the yard. He sacrifices it, losing 1 to find a tapped Overgrown Tomb. He reveals his top card after shuffling, showing Garruk Primal Hunter, and Martin then plays the Verdant Catacombs again. Heading to combat, Nick takes 2 from the Ramunap Excavator. Chris casts Serum Visions, drawing a card and scrying 2. He leaves both on top. He plays an Island, and then casts Thassa, God of the Sea. Nick is struggling for that land drop, and doesn't know if he should swing with the Summoner or clamp it. He decides to swing it because Chris agrees to take the hit as he feels bad for Nick. Nick pays for the Summoner's on attack trigger, making 1 elemental token, and pays for the Mentor trigger as it enters. He draws, and then passes, and has to discard down to 7. Eric plays a Plains off the top, and then a Wasteland. At this point, Martin also sacrifices his Verdant Catacombs to go and find another land, settling on a Dryad Arbor. He then heads to combat, swinging everything at Chris for 3. He then drops Sakur Tribe Elder and plays out his commander. Martin mills his top 2 and draws, and he plays a Forest off the top, revealing the Gitrog monster. He then plays a Forest from his hand and resolves the Deadbridge Chant, milling himself for 10 more cards. Martin then counts up the creatures in his yard, and he's able to cast Avatar of Woe for a significantly reduced cost because of his creature count. Martin then heads to combat, swinging the Excavator at Chris and the Oracle at Nick. Chris draws and casts Consecrated Sphinx in his main phase before passing turn. Nick draws and Chris draws too. Nick then uses Cultivate in his main phase, grabbing a basic for the field and one for his hand. He then plays the Plains and casts Swords to Plowshares on the Sphinx. This has the creature get exiled, and Chris gains 4 life, and Nick then passes. Eric draws and plays a Forest off the top. He casts Seedborn Muse and then drops a Duelist Heritage that he'd drawn earlier. Moving to combat, Eric gets his commander Double Strike as he declares her as an attacker and hits Martin with his commander. Martin takes a 6 commander damage, and Eric then passes. Martin untaps and so does Eric, and Martin then mills his 2 from the Nyx Weaver trigger, and he then resolves his Deadbridge chant. A swamp is randomly chosen and goes to Martin's hand. Martin then draws for turn and reveals Entomb off the top. He plays a Lotus Veil in his main phase from his yard, sacrificing 2 untapped lands. We then see a Detection Tower, and Martin then casts Polukranos. With his commander now resolving, Martin then brings out Lightning Greaves and moves them onto his commander. Heading to combat, Polukranos goes at Eric. Eric decides to just take the 6, and Martin then passes. Eric decides now is a good time to activate Shalai's ability to give all of his creatures a +1/+1 counter. Responding to the ability on the stack, Martin then taps his Avatar of Woe to try and destroy Shalai. Eric then responds to this by tapping some of his creatures and lands to cast Court of Calling. He puts 3 into the X and grabs a Bastion Protector who makes Shalai indestructible, essentially denying Martin's activation. Chris untaps and so does Eric. Chris scries 1 thanks to Thassa and bottoms it and plays an island. He casts one of my favorites, Burnished Heart, and then a Mana Vault. At the end of turn, Eric puts more counters onto his creature thanks to his commander. Eric and Nick untap for turn, and Nick draws. Nick heads to combat, and Chris agrees again to let him attack him because he still feels bad for him. The summoner goes at Chris, and with the attack trigger on the stack, Eric uses Wasteland to attempt to blow up Martin's Detection Tower. Before letting the land be destroyed, Martin activates it and allows his opponent's creatures and opponents to be targeted as though they didn't have hexproof. Nick then resolves the summoner trigger, making 1 elemental and paying the 1 to draw from the mentor trigger. Chris then takes the hit, and in his post-combat main phase, Nick clamps the elemental to draw 2. He passes, and Eric adds another counter to all of his creatures. Eric plays a Wooded Bastion off the top, and we then see an Oran Frostfang in Eric's main phase. Moving to combat, the team goes at Martin, with Eric giving Shalai Double Strike from his Duelist Heritage trigger. Martin blocks Shalai with the Nyx Weaver, and then takes the remaining creatures to the face, which amounts to 20 damage. Eric also gets to draw 4 cards from those creatures connecting thanks to the Frostfang triggers. Eric then casts an Idol on the Rhetoric in his second main phase, and passes. Martin and Eric untap, and Martin moves to resolve his Deadbridge chant trigger. Chris uses this as a chance to sacrifice his Burnished Heart, and goes to find 2 islands. The random card is his Harvester of Souls, and Martin gets to put it to the field, and then draws for turn. He replays a Detection Tower from his yard, and then a Swamp from his hand. He activates the tower, and taps the Avatar to destroy the Bastion Protector. It resolves, and Martin draws from the Harvester, seeing a creature die. Martin then has Polukranos fight the Idol and the Rhetoric, and Eric responds by activating Shalai to pump his board again. The Eidolon still dies, and Martin draws again from the Harvester. Martin then casts Entomb and bins his copy of Jared into the yard. He sacrifices a Swamp and his Dryad Arbor, drawing from the Harvester, seeing the Arbor die, to return Jared to his hand. 4 mana then gets Martin an Awakening, which seems pretty neat because now everyone has a Seedborn Muse, and he passes turn. Everyone gets to untap their lands and creatures on Chris's upkeep, and Martin uses the Avatar of Woe to take out Shalai. He doesn't draw because Shalai goes to the command zone though. Chris then plays an island and casts God Eternal Kefnet, and then Atemsis. He passes, and everyone untaps with Nick. After untapping with Nick in his upkeep, and before leaving, Martin uses the Avatar again to destroy the Seedborn Muse this time, and Nick then plays a Forest. Martin remembers to draw with the Harvester trigger, and once again, Nick and Chris agree to let Nick hit Chris with the Summoner. And as he does, Nick makes one Elemental token and draws from the Mentor trigger as the Elemental enters. He's got City's Blessing now, and in his second main phase, casts Harvest Season to go and find 2 basic mountains and put them into play tapped. At the end of turn, Chris uses Blue Sun Zenith, where X is 5, and draws 5 cards and shuffles the spell in. Everyone untaps with Eric, and Martin taps the Avatar again, this time taking out the Oracle of Moldiah. Martin draws from the Harvester trigger, and then Eric draws for turn. Eric then plays out Scavenging Ooze, and exiles 2 creature cards from Martin's yard, gaining 2 life, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters onto the Ooze. Moving to combat, Eric swings the Orin Viper and Pilgrim Frog at Martin. Martin blocks the Snake with the Harvester of Souls, and the Pilgrim with Polukranos. Martin chooses to have Polukranos go to the yard, which has him drawing 2 cards from the Harvester trigger seeing creatures die. Martin then reveals Pier off the top, and Eric then exiles Polukranos and the Harvester of Souls, gaining 2 more life and 2 more counters on his Ooze. He also exiles the Eternal Witness and Marin as well, gaining 2 more life and 2 more counters. At the end of turn, Chris casts the newly printed Thassa's Intervention, putting 6 into the X. He looks at his top 6 and keeps 2. Everyone untaps their lands and creatures with Martin, and on his upkeep, responding to the Deadbridge Chant trigger, Eric exiles 7 more creatures from Martin's yard, leaving only 1. He gains 7 life and adds 7 more counters to the Ooze. With the Chant trigger still on the stack, Martin then taps the Avatar to destroy the Scavenging Ooze. Martin then returns a swamp to his hand from resolving the Chant. In his main phase, Martin plays a Bajuka Bog and hits Eric's graveyard. He recasts Polukranos, who comes in with 7 +1/+1 counters instead of 6 because of Pier. Moving to combat, Martin then swings at Eric, who prevents the damage from one of them with Core Haven and takes 2. At the end of turn, Chris overloads a Cyclonic Rift, and Martin has to discard down to 7 once everything's back in his hand. Chris scries 1 and bottoms it before drawing for turn. He plays an island and swings an active Thassa and Kefnet at Martin, and Atemsis at Eric. With Atemsis connecting, Chris gets to reveal 6 cards from his hand with 6 different committed mana costs, and this causes Eric to lose the game. Moving to his post-combat main phase, Chris then plays out Telepathy. He then casts a Void Winnower and a Leyline of Anticipation before passing to Nick. Nick draws and casts Cathar's Crusade and Beastmaster Ascension before passing turn. Martin draws and casts Black Sun Zenith where X is 5. This gives the spell a converted mana cost of 7 when it hits the stack, getting around the Void Winnower clause. It wipes away most of the board, leaving the Void Winnower, and he shuffles it in, and then replays his Ramunap Excavator. Martin then plays a Crypt of Agadim from his yard, and passes. Chris loses the 1 to his mana vault, and draws. He casts Curse the Swine, making the Excavator into a piggy, who can no longer block with the Void Winnower out. Chris then takes full advantage of this, and takes out Martin. Chris then plays an island in his post-combat main phase, and passes. Nick draws and casts Angel of Inventions. It enters, and Nick layers his stack to resolve the Angel's Fabricate 2 trigger before resolving the Cathar's Crusade. This way he's able to maximize the amount of counters put on his creatures, and Nick then passes. At the end of turn, Chris casts Dig Through Time, delving away most of his cards in his graveyard to reduce the cost. He then casts Crush of Tentacles using the Surge cost and bounces everything back to his opponent's hands and gets an 8/8 Octopus. Chris plays a Temple of the False God and then Telepathy again. We then see a Magic Mirror for reduced cost thanks to the number of spells in Chris's yard before he casts Acquire. He takes Nick's copy of the Immortal Sun and then hits him for 8. Chris then plays a Mana Vault and passes. Nick draws and doesn't really see much that he can do at this point by himself, and he gives up the game to Chris. Game review time. So I think unfortunately for this game, the only deck that didn't really do a lot of cool stuff was Nick. He fell very far behind unfortunately due to his lack of lands, and by the time that he was able to get back into it, the game was almost all but over. If you had told me at the start of this game that someone would have lost to Atemsis' ability when he connects, I would have called you a liar. So a big thanks to Chris for bringing that deck out and for showing it off. I think he did a good job of flying under people's radar by telling Nick that he could hit him because he and Nick weren't much of a threat. This, plus the fact that Eric and Martin both had huge board states and were more afraid of each other than they were of anyone else, I think allowed him to cement his win at the end. I think as far as Shalai went, Eric played it pretty much to a T, with Seedborn Muse being an obvious powerhouse in the deck as soon as the commander's out. His creatures are going to get huge very, very quickly, and it took a lot of effort and a lot of cards from Martin to basically pull him back down. Martin did fill his graveyard heavily, which I think Polukranos would actually have wanted, but unfortunately he wasn't able to use the escape cost. I think escape is a very interesting and powerful mechanic in EDH, especially with all the ways to fill up your graveyard, and if you're looking for a really good example of it, you should check out the Commander Clash video that just went up last Saturday. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 AM Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/mtgmudsta. And lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/mtgmudsta. This video is brought to you in support by my patrons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit the link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.